Now, when we talk about investing strategy in general, there's one guiding universal principle that you should follow, and that is to minimize your volatility, given whatever your returns happen to be. So, the idea here is we don't want to take unnecessary risks. Now, volatility is just the up and down movement that happens in the value of an investment. So we don't want that to be too excessive. Now, naturally, some of it may be unavoidable if you're going to earn any return at all. There has to be some kind of risk involved. But at the same time, you can minimize your volatility without giving up too much in terms of your returns. So in following this principle, really there are two principles underneath that. One is not to use leverage or margin. What this really means is don't borrow money to then go invest it. Now, it is true that leverage will double your return, but this happens in both directions. So what would be, say, a 10% return becomes a 20% return. But at the same time, what would be a negative 10% becomes a negative 20% return. So this increases volatility, which is moving exactly the wrong direction. Instead, invest with your own money. Secondly, diversification is another key point. And just drawing out the point that variety will decrease your volatility without decreasing your overall return. Here, the classic example is you should invest both in stands that sell umbrellas and also ice cream stands. After all, then, regardless of what the weather is like, one of your investments is going to do well. And the idea is, on the sunny days, your ice cream stands are going to cancel out any losses that you might have to take on your umbrella stands, whereas on the rainy days, the gains you make in the umbrella stands will cancel out any losses from the ice cream stands. And that is, in effect, what happens when you diversify. Now, a couple other points of diversification in action, which often people don't pay much attention to. One is that it's a good idea to avoid owning much stock in your employer. This is, in fact, exactly the opposite of what your employer wants you to do. The key point here is that often one of the biggest investments you have is your own career. And that is, you have a job with your employer. That is a pretty big investment. Now, in order to diversify away from that, you need to have some of your financial well-being be dependent upon things other than your employer. So the reason we want to avoid owning stock in your employer is that it makes it very likely that things are going to go poorly for your stock portfolio at exactly the same time that you're at the highest risk of losing your job. The case here of Enron was quite famous, where you had lots of people that invested virtually all of their retirement in Enron. Then scandals happen that are no fault of these employees, but as a result, they lose their jobs because the company is not doing very well, and at the same time, they've lost their stock portfolio because the company's not doing very well. Right? Layoff plus poor performance at the same time is something we want to try to avoid. A second point would be owning some foreign stocks. Here, this is the same principle, where I'm an American, I'm very heavily invested in the American economy, just in terms of my own career. If things are going well here, then my job is very secure, I get raises and the like. At the same time, if things start turning very poor in the American economy, it becomes much more likely that I'm going to lose my job, and odds become much more likely that I'm not going to get good raises and the like. And so it's a good idea to own some foreign stocks. That way, if things aren't going well in the US, odds are reasonably good that they're doing well somewhere else in the world. So owning a good diversified portfolio that includes stocks not just from the country you live in, but from other countries is a good idea. Now what I do, I mentioned before, I do this allocation method. I do 5% in cash, 5% metals, 10% REITs, 20% bonds, 60% in stocks. Now here I have laid out in detail exactly what I hold. Just in brief, I like exchange-traded funds. The exchange-traded fund is a form of mutual fund. With a mutual fund, we have lots of different investors that put their money together in this mutual fund, or we're mutually funding it, and the mutual fund goes out and buys a variety of investments according to some set of principles that have been agreed upon. And so, for example, this one that I hold for my silver, I hold silver because I'm not rich enough to buy gold. This one, the rule is that they take whatever money is invested and they go out and they actually buy silver, and they're the ones that keep and maintain it. I don't have to have a pile of silver coins in my house. Or this REIT fund, what it actually does, it goes out and it buys stock in a number of different real estate investment trusts. So by investing in this one fund, I'm immediately diversified in this category of investment. So instead of just being with one trust that might possibly fall to corruption or just a bad local market, I'm invested in lots of different investment trusts just by investing in one fund. The same kind of principle applies for my bonds and my stock funds. You notice my stock funds, I have a global stock exchange-traded fund that has both U.S. and foreign companies in them. So that way I'm investing everywhere in the world. Every January I go through and I revisit and rebalance. Now turning more to just some general financial advice for those in their early 20s. In college, the real key is to try to minimize your expenses. The reality is that a lot of your time is being eaten up, as you know, by taking classes and by doing work for those classes. So odds are good you're probably not going to have a really high-paying job if you can actually afford to have a job at all at this point. So keep your expenses as low as you can. So do things like not buying a brand new car. If you have to have a car for some reason, buy one that's used. Perhaps buy one that's very used. If you can avoid any debt beyond your tuition loans, that's a really good idea. College is generally not the time you'd want to go out and, say, buy a house. As normally, when you graduate, you want to have the flexibility to go wherever the job happens to be. If you're already invested in a house, it's much more difficult for you to have that mobility. After college, try to keep your housing expenses really low. For most people, really early in their careers is when they do a lot of moving around. So it's probably not a good idea to buy a house right away. Often, I have also found in my experience, though this depends on the market, I found a decent apartment was often far cheaper than a decent house. The place that I lived in during graduate school for the last half of it, I lived in one of the northern suburbs outside of Columbus, Ohio. It was a very nice suburb. The houses there sold for, I believe, around $200,000 for the like 3-4 bedroom homes that were in the neighborhood that I lived in. But I lived in an apartment complex that was right beside this neighborhood, and there I paid, I believe it was $610 a month, something like that, for my wife and I for a 2-bedroom apartment. Right, we were young, we didn't have much stuff, we didn't need more space than the 2 bedrooms we had, and it was far, far cheaper, actually roughly half the payment that we would have to be making if we bought one of those $200,000 houses. It also gave us the flexibility when I finally graduated from graduate school to go and find wherever the job was and to go there. Right. Then what you should do, keep your housing expenses low and save any of extra money to pay off that student loan that you have. My wife and I got very devoted to this. My wife had some student loans from graduate school while I was still in grad school. We paid off all of her student loans within a year. And let me tell you, it felt wonderful to write that last check, and even better to get the check back saying that I'd paid too much. So I actually got a little bit of money back from the bank that we had the student loan with. So that feels really, really nice, and also meant that we had one less bill when we went out to start our lives once we were both done with graduate school and things started to stabilize more. I'd also advise, as much as possible, avoid auto debt. Remember, when you have a car loan, you have to pay interest. If you save up for a car, you're earning interest in the process. It may not be much, because it's probably not a huge sum of money, but you're actually having interest flow the right way. You want it coming toward you, not away. Now, this might mean you have to buy a very inexpensive, very used car at first, but for most of us, that's actually okay. Right? All you really need is a box with an engine and wheels that will actually get you to work so you can do your job, and presumably also get you back home so you can enjoy time off from work. But as long as the car will do that, it very well may serve all your purposes. So don't go splurging on this huge car expense when really it may not be that good of an investment for you. Right? Keep yourself out of auto debt as much as you possibly can. In my case, my wife and I, after we were first married, we had these 2 old cars. Mine was a car that I bought in 2005. It was $3,150. At the time that I'm saying this, I believe it's 12 years, maybe a little bit older than, I think 13 years old now. Okay. The truck that my wife had, it was actually inherited from her grandfather. It's 22, 23 years old, and my wife paid $1 for it to her mom, so it got passed down that way just to pay the transfer. Our total monthly expenses for this, for the time that I was checking it before we stopped using the truck, it's $530 a month. That included putting all the gasoline in these, insuring them. It ends up insurance on old cars is really cheap. Average repairs, which repairs on old cars tends to be more expensive. Registration, maintenance, all of that was included. At the time that I did this math, the relatively I guess, low-end Chevy was the Chevy Cobalt, kind of a mid-size car, the equivalent of what, say, the Cavalier would have turned into. For that, if I were to buy 2 of those new, so I have 2 vehicles, it would be $500 a month in car payments alone. I think it's obvious which of these is the cheaper option.